It is Monday, September the 28th, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Divine Inheritance, Thomas Paine's Agrarian Justice. Yeah, it's just me, and we're going to talk a little bit about Agrarian Justice, which if you haven't read it, great. We're going to basically read the whole thing together while I give some setup, some commentary, some conclusion. Been rethinking Paine's views on the spirit, how he fused it with his efforts in politics. He's basically the only missionary I've ever encountered that doesn't annoy the shit out of me. Of course, before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that this show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you. They have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant. Become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Which gives you access to a Discord where you can hang out with me. If you really want to do that. And some other cool people. Two quick things before I get started. To anyone observing Yom Kippur, I bid you easy fast. Not of that persuasion myself, but I hope that you and yours are keeping well in these times. Also, just a reminder, still a Twitch channel. Still one that I help contribute to. It's at twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. It streams a lot. Definitely on Monday nights, but also whenever we feel like it. So if you want to hang out, talk politics, socialism, etc. with me and the boys, Bro Bra and Kentucky Fried Comrade. Yeah, that's twitch.tv/postpostrevolution. On with the show. Just one note on the narrative before I begin. Thomas Paine lived and wrote over 200 years ago. And though as long as there are people who love human freedom and equality, there will be people who read his works, he was still a creature of his time. I am going to make the case that he loved and thought for all humankind this episode, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, language, sex, gender, indeed any sort of barrier at all. He was not flawless in this, but he kept that flame burning in his heart as brightly as he could for as long as he could, and it warded away the shadows of prejudice effectively, in my judgment. However, he knew nothing of intersectionality, or the social construction of gender, and its difference from sex or sexual orientation, and a great many other things. And so, for example, he frequently refers to mankind as opposed to humankind, asserts that God created only male and female, and uses other language that might be considered somewhat archaic. I have not altered or avoided this language, but if it bothers you, I hope that, at least by the end of the episode, you are convinced that this old, dead, cisgendered straight white man should be taken at his word when he speaks of every person needing justice in every nation of the earth. On November 6, 1794, Thomas Paine was 57 years old, and he was in very bad shape. More than just the 10 months in French prison, he had suffered a lot, both materially and psychically, his whole life. He was a widower, a man who had loved once. Thomas Paine is not remembered as a man much enamored with romance, and is remembered as a man of great rhetorical skill, yet even as a young man, felt powerless to describe love like this, quote, "'Tis that delightful transport we can feel, which painter cannot paint nor words reveal, nor any art we know of can conceal. Canst thou describe sunbeams to the blind, or make him feel a shadow with his mind? So neither can we by description show the first of all felicities below." End quote. He was a failure in commerce many times over, to the point that even a second unconsummated marriage to help him solidify his business ventures could not bring him success. He had already nearly died many times on his first voyage across the Atlantic, in a riot in which he was mistaken for a nobleman, from disease in prison, and was even scheduled to be executed days before the fall of Robespierre, now months in the past. In that space of time when he was too popular to be arrested, yet it was too dangerous for him to occupy his seat in the National Assembly, in opposition to Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, he never would have dreamed of supporting their efforts during Les Deluges. He was already falling into a deep depression, fueled by a growing sense that he wasn't just underappreciated by the American and French republics he had helped to found, but actively in danger of their machinations, a sensation that will crystallize as he spends 10 months in that prison, due mostly to the contrivance of the American minister to the French, Mr. Gouverneur Morris. Yet Paine had still had enough thought for others that even in his final days of bitter freedom, he did all he could to help other foreigners in France flee the country, while he watched the rest suffer imprisonment or execution, and all the while made zero plans to leave himself. Whether he thought he was safe, or whether he felt driven to accept martyrdom, I do not know, but I do know that he was fortunate to be alive in November 1794. But if he himself was alive, the man who had been called Thomas Paine before the Terror was dead. He went back to drinking, which may have helped him medicate his many ailments, but did nothing to make his temperament more agreeable, which had already tended towards the headstrong. It is from this period of his life that he gets many of his most reprehensible reputational characteristics. An asshole and a drunk and a filthy atheist who doesn't pay rent, an amoral propagandist, nothing more than a skilled but sensationalist pamphleteer, whose political philosophy is an amateurish mimicry of Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Smith. He wrote and published much of Part 2 of Age of Reason during this time, and it is considered by most Paine scholars to be the worst of his major works. It is said there is no playfulness to it, which deals primarily with proving the Christian Bible is a bunch of nonsense. It has no humor or personality or positive vision. It is usually considered a takedown, sneering and vulgar, full of the sort of bitterness that only springs, perhaps, from the wounding of someone who truly believes in one for all, and comes to believe that while he does his best to remember everyone, so many find him easy to forget. I don't agree that Age of Reason is as bad as all that, but the historians have a point. Something was different about him now. Paine was bitter and isolated, his views on politics and religion increasingly ignored or attacked by the citizens of the republics he had helped to midwife, the United States and France, and his dreams of a better world and a common good seemingly dashed to pieces. He was well on his way to slipping from underappreciated to hated to forgotten. And this would be his end for a time, buried by only a surrogate family, his friend Nicholas Bonneville's wife Marguerite Brazier Bonneville, her son Benjamin, a Quaker farmer, and 2 or 3 black freedmen. And yet, he had one great pamphlet left in him, one last original hit, at least one last banger effort, to see the world not just as it was and is, but could be. It might seem to be nothing more than a short little work about a land tax to establish a welfare scheme, and that is certainly what it was. But it was also more than that. A phenomenal piece of poetry, really, in the form of public policy, a vision for humanity that recognizes that, on the most fundamental level, we are the ones who give each other meaning, and no one is either strong enough to escape this fact, nor weak enough to be undeserving of the efforts that recognizing this fact compels. First published in 1797, but written in the wake of his new freedom, Agrarian Justice is more properly titled, in the English edition at least, quote, Agrarian Justice, opposed to agrarian law and to agrarian monopoly, being a plan for ameliorating the condition of man by creating in every nation a national fund to pay to every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of £15 sterling, to enable him or her to begin the world, and also £10 sterling per annum during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others when they shall arrive at that age, to enable them to live in old age without wretchedness and go decently out of the world. End quote. The consensus take by historians on Paine's Agrarian Justice, even by those of a more leftward bent, is one of appreciation but limited in magnitude. An interesting bit of trivia, the bare bones of a welfare state realized in terms both practical and philosophical, and promptly ignored for generations by those with any power to institute it in states great and small. One of the more readable copies out there exists on the United States Social Security website, which is nice, but hardly says much for any radicalism it might possess for us today, and much of the pamphlet deals in matters of accounting. How nice that Paine took the time. How good it was that, after suffering so much and for so long, he could still put himself to the task, sit at the desk, and write such a little pamphlet, and not only vituperative screeds about how Christianity is a lie and Washington a puffed-up buffoon. The pamphlet respects the role of private property and seeks to reward individual merit, and because it predates the device of Marx, it contains no triggering language about the means and modes of production, or historical materialism, or anything so cool or lame, depending on your disposition. It's a very old work, so it does not speak of economic development and industrialization and capitalism so much as cultivation. But even there, it speaks of a tax on that cultivated land. Paine goes out of his way to explain, though, that he does not want to socialize such things. Here is a wise and singular man, Thomas Paine, but one who still keeps his pew in the church of Adam Smith, a capitalist in his bones. I used to count myself among those types, and I no longer do. There is more to agrarian justice here, and to Paine's economics generally than that. There is a universalism to some of this pamphlet's ideas. It is a beautiful synthesis of desire for all of humankind to see one another as connected and meaningless without one another, and all living upon the earth that sustains us. A great chain of being, no longer running vertically but horizontally, unconnected from the divine above, and linked through the divinity within every human being, all of them joint inheritors of the natural world, that humanity has done much to transform into the wonders of civilization, and nothing to stop the concentration of its bounty. Deism, at least for Paine, was not just the religion of science, and certainly not only the worship of reason, but a paradoxical monotheism in which God can only be seen in his creation, and worshipped by improving the lot of all humanity. And the greatest improvement was liberty and justice for all the people of creation, completely divorced from national identity or class position or status within such and such a nation. All of this might not seem to have much to do with a land tax and welfare state, this reading of a policy proposal as a religious document, but I read agrarian justice with this sort of thing in mind, summed up in this brief sentence of Paine's From the Age of Reason, quote, "I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy." End quote. The prelude is composed. Let us move on to the cantata. The English preface to Agrarian Justice is useful in proving that I'm not just blabbering when I speak of this pamphlet as spiritual. Quote, "What has determined me to publish it now, that is, this pamphlet, is a sermon preached by Watson, Bishop of Llandaff. Some of my readers will recollect that this bishop wrote a book entitled An Apology for the Bible, in answer to my second part of The Age of Reason. I procured a copy of his book, and he may depend upon hearing from me on that subject. At the end of the bishop's book is a list of the works he has written, among which is the sermon alluded to. It is entitled, The Wisdom and Goodness of God, and having made both rich and poor, with an appendix, containing reflections on the present state of England and France. The error contained in this sermon determined me to publish my Agrarian Justice. It is wrong to say God made rich and poor. He made only male and female, and he gave them the earth for their inheritance. Instead of preaching to encourage one part of mankind in insolence, it would be better that priests employ their time to render the general condition of man less miserable than it is. Practical religion consists in doing good, and the only way of serving God is that of endeavoring to make his creation happy. All preaching that has not this for its object is nonsense and hypocrisy." Thomas Paine. He continues the pamphlet proffer. Quote, "To preserve the benefits of what is called civilized life, and to remedy at the same time the evil which it has produced, ought to be considered as one of the first objects of reformed legislation. Whether that state that is proudly, perhaps erroneously, called civilization, has most promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested. On one side, the spectator is dazzled by splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by extremes of wretchedness, both of which it has erected. The most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in the countries that are called civilized. To understand what the state of society ought to be, it is necessary to have some idea of the natural and primitive state of man, such as it is this day among the Indians of North America. There is not in that state any of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets in Europe. Poverty, therefore, is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. On the other hand, the natural state is without those advantages which flow from agriculture, arts, science, and manufactures. The life of an Indian is a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, and on the other hand it appears to be abject when compared to the rich. Civilization, therefore, or that which is so called, has operated two ways, to make one part of society more affluent and the other more wretched than would have been the lot of either in a natural state. It is always possible to go from the natural to the civilized state, but it is never possible to go from the civilized to the natural state. The reason is that man in a natural state, subsisting by hunting, requires 10 times the quantity of land to range over to procure himself sustenance than would support him in a civilized state where the earth is cultivated. When, therefore, a country becomes populous by the additional aids of cultivation, art, and science, there is a necessity of preserving things in that state, because without it there cannot be sustenance for more, perhaps, than a 10th part of its inhabitants. The thing, therefore, now to be done is to remedy the evils and preserve the benefits that have arisen to society by passing from the natural to that which is called the civilized state. In taking the matter upon this ground, the first principle of civilization ought to have been, and ought still to be, that the condition of every person born into the world, after a state of civilization commences, ought not to be worse than if he had been born before that period. End quote. Now, Paine's understanding of the indigenous peoples of the Americas in the late 18th century is erroneous. Lots of them had done and were doing plenty of cultivation and societal development, so do not take his path and imagine such people. And instead, imagine their and our distant ancestors, before the dominance of agriculture, and you may understand better. Paine has sniffed out something universal in how economies developed in each nation, how improvement of the land supports a population that grows in both number and variation, and has led to the growth of art, science, literature, culture, all the things that make life worth living in our modern times, instead of just the things required for us to live. And yet this development has made the vast majority of people worse off, sometimes in absolute terms and always in relative ones. Paine is no primitivist. He thinks it neither desirable nor practical, but he has some radically egalitarian ideas about property rights in the distant past. The author continues, quote, "It is a position not to be controverted that the earth in its natural, uncultivated state was, and ever would have continued to be, the common property of the human race. In that state, every man would have been born to property. He would have been a joint life propriety with the rest in the property of the soil and in all its natural productions, vegetable and animal. But the earth in its natural state, as before said, is capable of supporting but a small number of inhabitants compared with what it is capable of doing in a cultivated state. And as it is impossible to separate the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that parable connection. But it is nevertheless true that it is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property." Every proprietor, therefore, of cultivated lands owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds, and it is from this ground rent that the fund proposed in this plan is to issue. It is deducible, as well as from the nature of the thing as from all the stories transmitted to us, that the idea of landed property commenced with cultivation, and that there was no such thing as landed property before that time. It could not exist in the first state of man, that of hunters. It did not exist in the second state, that of shepherds. Neither Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, nor Job, so far as the history of the Bible may be credited in probable things, were owners of land. Their property consisted, as is always enumerated, in flocks and herds. They traveled with them from place to place. The frequent contentions at that time about the use of a well in the dry country of Arabia, where those people lived, also show that there was no landed property. It was not admitted that land could be claimed as property. There could be no such thing as landed property originally. Man did not make the earth, and though he had a natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate as his property in perpetuity any part of it. Neither did the creator of the earth open a land office, from whence the first title deeds should issue. Whence then arose the idea of landed property? I answer as before, that when cultivation began, the idea of landed property began with it, from the impossibility of separating the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, upon which that improvement was made. The value of the improvement so far exceeded the value of the natural earth at that time as to absorb it, till in the end the common right of all became confounded into the cultivated right of the individual. But there are nevertheless distinct species of rights, and will continue to be, so long as the earth endures." End quote. I would quibble a bit with Paine here, too. It is true that ideas of property that feel familiar to us modern humans have roots in the fact that our ancestors eventually settled and tilled the land. But there is also the role of blood and kinship, and the fact that farming, especially early and primitive farming, needed to be a collective effort, not an individual one, to be successful. The individual's property rights were still pretty subservient to the families or clans or tribes who lived off that land, I'd say, in these sorts of societies that engaged in agriculture. But Paine is right that the work that people put into land cannot be easily separated from it. The native peoples of Georgia used to regularly burn their fields in order to replenish the soil here hundreds of years ago, and even the work of a single person tilling and tending a small garden, well, it isn't as though that labor improves the yield of any other garden but the labor it is done in, and there is no way to compensate for this but with the bounty of that land, whether field or garden. When you own someone's land, you also bizarrely own all the work that's ever been done to land, for that is what gives its value. Now, Paine is pre-Marxist, of course, but by improvement, I would venture to say that it's better for us not to imagine so much physical improvement, but the improvement that results from labor. You might say that labor gives the land value. So Paine's sniffing around the edges of the labor theory of value, maybe, though I'm sure I could find plenty of disagreement about that idea. Anyway, when humanity was young and not so good at farming, the earth belonged to all, and why should it not again? Paine calls this idea agrarian law, and says, quote, "Nothing can be more unjust than agrarian law in a country improved by cultivation. For though every man as an inhabitant of the earth is a joint proprietor of it in its natural state, it does not follow that he is a joint proprietor of cultivated earth. The additional value made by cultivation after the system was admitted became the property of those who did it, or who inherited it from them, or who purchased it. It had originally no owner. While therefore I advocate the right and interest myself in the hard case of all those who have been thrown out of their natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property, I equally defend the right of the possessor to the part which is his. Cultivation is at least one of the greatest natural improvements ever made by human invention. It has given to created earth a tenfold value, but the landed monopoly that began with it has produced the greatest evil. It has dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance without providing for them, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before. In advocating the case of the persons thus dispossessed, it is a right and not a charity that I am pleading for. But it is that kind of right which, being neglected at first, could not be brought forward afterwards till heaven had opened the way by a revolution in the system of government. Let us then do honor to revolutions by justice, and give currency to their principles by blessings." End quote. It might seem as though Paine is just soft on an unjust and miserable system, this private holding of the means of production, which in his time period really meant land mostly. They bought it or inherited it on terms fair and square in many cases, but this is the course of economic development in every industry, including agriculture, a tendency towards consolidation for ever more efficient profit extraction. We may be talking justice, but there is no use condemning the wheels of history. He goes on, quote, "I have already established the principle, namely, that the earth in its natural uncultivated state was and ever would have continued to be the common property of the human race, that in that state every person would have been born to property, and that the system of landed property by its inseparable connection with cultivation and with what is called civilized life has absorbed the property of all those whom it dispossessed, without providing, as ought to have been done, an indemnification for that loss. The fault, however, is not in the present possessors. No complaint is intended or ought to be alleged against them unless they adopt the crime by opposing justice. The fault is in the system, and it has stolen perceptibly upon the world, aided afterwards by the agrarian law of the sword. But the fault can be made to reform itself by successive generations, and without diminishing or deranging the property of any of its present possessors. The operation of the fund can yet commence, and in full activity, the first year of its establishment, or soon after, as I shall show. It is proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich or poor. It is best to make it so, to prevent invidious distinctions. It is also right it should be so, because it is in lieu of natural inheritance, which as a right belongs to every man over and above property he may have created or inherited from those who did. Such persons as do not choose to receive it can throw it into the common fund. Taking it then for granted that no person ought to be in a worse condition when born under what is called a state of civilization than he would have been had he been born in a state of nature, and that civilization ought to have made, and ought still to make, provision for that purpose, it can only be done by subtracting from property a portion equal in value to the natural inheritance it has absorbed." End quote. For a boring old social democrat who respects property rights, Paine doesn't seem to think of them in quite the same way as your average capitalist. If justice demands recognizing that everyone originally had a share in the property that is the earth, then everyone on earth is a landowner. And if you don't actually hold title to any land, your property rights have been diminished. Coupled with his assertion that the fund should pay to all, titled or not, this is a truly socialist vision, I think, of all of humanity connected throughout the generations, owed to the fundamental truth that we needed each other then, and we need each other now. Paine next makes fun of the British for blowing their cash on losing a war with France, sketches out some details of his fund, which has a special payout for those with disabilities, and does some calculations before moving on to a few more observations. Quote, "It is not charity but a right, not bounty, but justice that I am pleading for. The present state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust. It is absolutely the opposite of what it should be, and it is necessary that a revolution should be made in it. The contrast of affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together. Though I care as little about riches as any man, I am a friend to riches because they are capable of good. I care not how affluent some may be, provided that none be miserable in consequence of it. But it is impossible to enjoy affluence with the felicity as capable of being enjoyed, while so much misery is mingled in the scene. The sight of the misery and the unpleasant sensations it suggests, which, though they may be suffocated, cannot be extinguished, are a greater drawback upon the felicity of affluence than the proposed 10% upon property is worth. He that would not give the one to get rid of the other has no charity even for himself. There are, in every country, some magnificent charities established by individuals. It is, however, but little that any individual can do, when the whole extent of the misery to be relieved is considered. He may satisfy his conscience, but not his heart. He may give all that he has, and that all will relieve but little. It is only by organizing civilization upon such principles as to act like a system of pulleys that the whole weight of misery can be removed." End quote. We are now finished with any hedges regarding the cruelty of the landed classes of the world. Paine has no time for any not all rich people talk. He speaks here as a friend to riches, but because of what wealth can create in the world. The alleviation of suffering, and the ability to pursue what one likes instead of what one must more and more. And when he says, quote, organizing civilization, what he might as easily refer to is a social revolution. Quote, it is justice and not charity. That is the principle of the plan. In all great cases, it is necessary to have a principle more universally active than charity. And with respect to justice, it ought not to be left to the choice of detached individuals whether they will do justice or not. Considering, then, the plan on the ground of justice, it ought to be the act of the whole growing spontaneously out of the principles of the revolution, and the reputation of it ought to be national and not individual. End quote. Now, if Paine speaking of national revolutions makes you wince a bit, I am among you. It's mostly because there's no bigger social body for him to point to. The economy was just barely globalizing in his day, but it still took weeks or months for anything to travel from place to place, when all you've got for transportation on land is horses, and on water is wind-powered ships, more or less. There's not really any way to communicate an international consciousness across all those language barriers, times, and spaces in Paine's day. This is as big as things get, the nation, even if it might seem small to us, living in the aftermath of World War. Skipping ahead in the pamphlet slightly, quote, the rugged face of society, checkered with the extremes of affluence and want, proves that some extraordinary violence has been committed upon it, and calls on justice for redress. The great mass of the poor in countries are become a hereditary race, and it is next to impossible for them to get out of that state themselves. It ought also to be observed that this mass increases. In all countries that are called civilized, more persons fall annually into it than get out of it. Though in a plan of which justice and humanity are the foundational principles, interest ought not to be admitted into the calculation, yet it is always of advantage to the establishment of any plan to show that it is beneficial as a matter of interest. The success of any proposed plan submitted to public consideration must finally depend on the numbers interested in supporting it, united with the justice of its principles. The plan here proposed will benefit all, without injuring any. It will consolidate the interest of the Republic with that of the individual. To the numerous class dispossessed of their natural inheritance by the system of landed property, it will be an act of national justice. To persons dying possessed of moderate fortunes, it will operate as a tontine for their children, more beneficial than the sum of money paid into the fund, and it will give to the accumulation of riches a degree of security that none of the old governments of Europe, now tottering on their foundations, can give. End quote. I am struck by both Paine's shrewd analysis and his pitched universalism to the privileged themselves. He has identified the intensifying exploitation of labor, and what Helen Keller learned herself centuries later when she wrote, quote, I had once believed that we are all masters of our fate, that we could mold our lives into any form we pleased. I had overcome deafness and blindness sufficiently to be happy, and I supposed that anyone could come out victorious if he threw himself valiantly into life's struggle. But as I went more and more about the country, I learned that I had spoken with assurance on a subject I knew little about. I forgot that I owed my success partly to the advantages of my birth and environment. Now, however, I learned that the power to rise in the world is not within the reach of everyone. End quote. I sometimes wonder if Helen Keller ever read that Paine not only reached that conclusion long ago, but that he had already taken care to imagine that someone like her deserves the fullest life they can have. Skipping a couple paragraphs, quote, I have made the calculations stated in this plan upon what is called personal as well as upon landed property. The reason for making it upon land is already explained, and the reason for taking personal property into the calculation is equally well founded, though on a different principle. Land, as before said, is the free gift of the Creator in common to the human race. Personal property is the effect of society, and it is as impossible for an individual to acquire personal property without the aid of society as it is for him to make land originally. Separate an individual from society, and give him an island or a continent to possess, and he cannot acquire personal property. He cannot be rich. So inseparably are the means connected with the end in all cases, that where the former do not exist, the latter cannot be obtained. All accumulation, therefore, of personal property beyond what a man's own hands produce is derived to him by living in society, and he owes on every principle of justice, of gratitude, and of civilization a part of that accumulation back again to society from whence the whole came. This is putting the matter on a general principle, and perhaps it is best to do so. For if we examine the cases minutely, it will be found that the accumulation of personal property is, in many instances, the effect of paying too little for the labor that produced it, the consequence of which is that the working hand perishes in old age, and the employer abounds in affluence. It is, perhaps, impossible to proportion exactly the price of labor to the profits it produces, and it will also be said, as an apology for the injustice, that were a workman to receive an increase of wages daily, he would not save it against old age, nor be much better for it in the interim. Make, then, society the treasurer, to guard for him in a common fund, for it is no reason that, because he might not make a good use of it himself, another should take it. End quote. All in all, this is really my favorite stuff, truth be told. And here's where Paine deserves to be commended for observations of deep truth. True, Paine makes no Marxist distinctions between personal and private property as you or I might desire, and instead speaks of landed property and personal property, feudal and capitalist property, we might put it. But what he has discovered is fundamental on both an economic and spiritual level. Imagine you are alone in the world. You have no idea how alone, just that wherever you go, you cannot find another person. You would be master of all you surveyed, the richest person in history, and the poorest too. Everything that gives us meaning, all the fruits of civilization that we enjoy both physically and psychically, are the product of a society we did nothing to create. And even the material pleasures we can obtain through commodification, dull and tedious, when they can only be enjoyed in solitude. Paine may be too grounded in his times to insist that it is only labor that produces profit, referring to the bit about it being impossible to proportion the price of labor to the profit it produces, but he is not so much a prisoner of his times that he cannot see that value itself is derived from society. Quote, the state of civilization that has prevailed throughout Europe is as unjust in its principle as it is horrid in its effects. And it is the consciousness of this and the apprehension that such a state cannot continue when once investigation begins in any country that makes the possessors of property dread every idea of a revolution. It is the hazard and not the principle of revolutions that retards their progress, This being the case, it is necessary as well for the protection of property as for the sake of justice and humanity, to form a system that, while it preserves one part of society from wretchedness, shall secure the other from depreciation. The superstitious awe, the enslaving reverence that formerly surrounded affluence is passing away in all countries, and leaving the possessor of property to the convulsion of accidents. When wealth and splendor, instead of fascinating the multitude, excites emotions of disgust, when, instead of drawing forth admiration, it is beheld as an insult on wretchedness, when the ostentatious appearance it makes serves to call the right of it into question, the case of property becomes critical. And it is only in a system of justice that the possessor can contemplate security. To remove the danger, it is necessary to remove the antipathies, and this can only be done by making property productive of a national blessing, extending to every individual. When the riches of one man above another shall increase the national fund in the same proportion, when it shall be seen that the prosperity of that fund depends on the prosperity of individuals, when the more riches a man acquires, the better it shall be for the general mass, it is then that antipathies will cease, and property be placed on the permanent basis of national interest and protection. I have no property in France to become subject to the plan I propose. What I have, which is not much, is in the United States of America. But I will pay £100 sterling towards this fund in France the instant it shall be established, and I will pay the same sum in England whenever a similar establishment shall take place in that country. End quote. Always the persuader, even when waxing vaguely utopian. I haven't said too much about it since the introduction, but Paine is fresh off of playing a leading role in two political revolutions, which were driven in large part by material factors. He's casting a shadow using the French example here, obviously, for it took only 2 generations for Versailles to go from the court of an all-powerful Sun King to Republican property. The richer you are, the more you owe to the society that produced you. And so, yes, this is justice and not mercy, but also for your own damn good, both for the better world it will build and to save your neck from the likes of La Guillotine. And hell, Paine will throw the first coin into the pot. I will conclude reading Agrarian Justice with this passage, quote, "A revolution in the state of civilization is the necessary companion of revolutions in the system of government. If a revolution in any country be from bad to good or from good to bad, the state of what is called civilization in that country must be made conformable thereto, to give that revolution effect. Despotic government supports itself by abject civilization, in which debasement of the human mind and wretchedness in the mass of the people are the chief criterions. Such governments consider man merely as an animal, that the exercise of intellectual faculty is not his privilege, that he has nothing to do with the laws but to obey them, and they politically depend more upon breaking the spirit of the people by poverty than they fear enraging it by desperation. It is a revolution in the state of civilization that will give perfection to revolution in France. Already the conviction that government by representation is the true system of government is spreading itself fast in the world. The reasonableness of it can be seen by all. The justness of it makes itself felt even by its opposers. But when a system of civilization growing out of that system of government shall be so organized that not a man or woman born in the republic but shall inherit some means of beginning the world, and see before them the certainty of escaping the miseries that under other governments accompany old age, the Revolution of France will have an advocate and ally in the heart of all nations. An army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. It will succeed where diplomatic management would fall. It is neither the Rhine, the Channel, nor the ocean that can arrest its progress. It will march on the horizon of the world, and it will conquer." End quote. Paine speaks of civilization, using as ably as ever the vocabulary available to him, but a better, if clunkier term for us today might be mode of production. In other words, how a society is organized and stratified in terms of who does what to make all the goods and services that characterize life. This, too, any successful revolution must deal with. Revolutions for Paine are not just about political questions like whether people vote, who gets to vote, and what they get to vote for, but their position in society, what they do for a living, and what sort of living that gets them. And even hints towards that elusive dream of an international consciousness based upon his proposal, and the ideas it contains about what we all owe one another. I will close the episode with this. Though many of his generation called themselves deists, or at least held some broad sympathies with this theology, I would venture that Paine's religion was quite a bit more serious to him than most. I used to say he was the only American political revolutionary worth a damn, the only one even close to actually being revolutionary. I still believe that. But it's just as true to say he was far more pious a deist than they ever were, too. He really did believe in God. And he really thought the only way to know God was through creation, which meant all of humanity in the world. Science was the wisdom of God, certainly, but it was also a means to increasing human liberty, both social and political. And that was the point, for this universal divinity compelled him to work towards a material realizing of that inherent equality. Reason is divine for him, but it's only ever observed in grubby little humans by other grubby little humans. And so does this grubby little human conclude with a mashup of a bit of Paine's practical political theology. Quote, "Deism teaches us, without the possibility of being deceived, all that is necessary or proper to be known. The creation is the Bible of the deist. He there reads in the handwriting of the Creator himself the certainty of his existence, the immutability of his power, and all other Bibles and Testaments are to him forgeries. The probability that we may be called to account hereafter will, to reflecting minds, have the influence of belief, for it is not our belief or disbelief that can make or unmake the fact. As this is the state we are in which it is proper we should be in as free agents, it is the fool only, and not the philosopher, nor even the prudent man, that will live as if there were no God. We can know God only through his works. We cannot have a conception of any one attribute, but by following some principle that leads to it. We have only a confused idea of his power, if we have not the means of comprehending something of its immensity. We can have no idea of his wisdom, but by knowing the order and manner in which it acts, the principles of science lead to this knowledge. For the creator of man is the creator of science, and it is through that medium that man can see God, as it were, face to face. But I believe in the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy." End quote. It might seem quaint to place such faith in, quote, science, but science to Paine was more than just the scientific method, or even the sciences broadly speaking, but the study and manipulation of the natural world by humans, which is how we support our existence. Even as he differentiates between the natural and artificial, he regards all of it as divine creation. And agrarian justice contains this seed of divinity. We humans across the globe are bound to one another, and all are joint inheritors of the earth, simply by virtue of being born, and acknowledging this through a universal program that secures to everyone, literally everyone, a dignified existence in every nation. We are in desperate need of it. Because in the United States, at least, for all our skill at art and science and engineering, we are nonetheless unable to bring it to bear on a mass level. 200,000 people are dead during a pandemic, but for so many in the United States, the life of the other is cheap, and human suffering is at best a tragedy, not a reason for action, for no one means anything to each other, either politically or spiritually, and no one owes each other anything beyond what our oligarchic capitalism dictates. We would do better to ground ourselves in the natural, material world and regard it all as Paine did, as divine. Thank you for listening. That's amazing. It's weird that people do that, but it is pretty cool. Hope it wasn't too off my rocker this episode. It might be a little weird to hear an atheist talk so much about God and creation, the sacred and the divine, and then try to tie it all to a welfare state, but I think there's something there. If you don't think there's something there, you can find me on Twitter at JeffSNews. You can yell at me. You can even become a patron at patreon.com/distantpeasant. You can join my Discord. You can yell at me there. You can go to paypal.me/distantpeasant. You can give me money and attach a note that says, hey, you're an asshole and you're wrong about agrarian justice. Feel free to do any of those things. I will see you next time.